Year 1946. I am 31 years old. Harriet calls and says 4 words. There's a role. Listen to me. When Harriet says, listen to me, instead of her usual, I have something for you, it means that something is different from what's come before. I listen. The role. A woman in a theatrical drama, a Broadway production, not off, not a small studio, Broadway. A director with a reputation, a producer with money, a text with ambitions. The role is supporting, but real. A woman who has her own story, her own arc, her own reason for being on the stage. The audition is in a week. Harriet says, this time you enter differently. You're not one of 100. You're the person I want them to see on that stage. Go in there with that certainty. I ask, how do you do that without arrogance? She says, the difference between confidence and arrogance is the same as the difference between an actress and a woman pretending to be one. You know which you are. That is one of those sentences that stays with a person. Preparing for an audition for a major role is different from preparing for a minor one. Not technically. Technically, you prepare the same way. You learn the text, you work on the character, you practice cold reading. But there's an additional layer you can call stakes. When you audition for 5 lines in a small production, the stakes are real but contained. If you don't get it, there's a next one. The next opportunity is around the corner. Maybe small, but it's there. When you go for a Broadway audition for a role that's genuinely worth having, the stakes are different. It's not fear, because fear doesn't help you. It's something more subtle, an awareness that this matters, that it has a significance the previous auditions didn't. How to live with that through a week of preparation. You teach yourself not to think about how much it means when you're practicing. You think only about the scene, only about the character, only about this specific sentence, this specific moment, this specific breath. And when you walk into the room, you release the stakes. The stakes are yours. The room is theirs. In the room, you give them what you've prepared, and if it's good, it's good. If it isn't what they're looking for, it isn't what they're looking for. I walked into the room. I gave them what I'd prepared. I got the role. The daily life of an actress, outside the stage. I want to tell you about what is between auditions, between rehearsals, between performances. About what an actress does when she's not actively being an actress, but is still being an actress, because that is a state which has no off switch. There are no days off. Let me explain. A professional actress has no days off, in the sense of days when she isn't working. She has days when she's not on set or on stage or in a rehearsal room. Those days are filled with another form of work. Work that's invisible, that no one pays for, that is nonetheless just as essential as rehearsals and auditions. First, text. I'm always in the middle of learning something. A monologue, a scene, a play I'm reading because I might pursue it, because the playwright is interesting, because I want to understand how this particular person constructs tension. Text is always present. Text is a muscle, as the old actor in The Wings said. Don't exercise it, it atrophies. Second, observation. I go out, not because I have a specific goal. I go out to watch. On 42nd Street at noon, where every possible person with every possible errand crosses paths, and none of them knows I'm watching them. Waitresses in restaurants, how they carry plates, how they remember orders, how they manage 6 tables simultaneously with apparent ease. Older men on park benches, women in store queues, children running in front of apartment buildings. Every one of those observations goes into the storehouse. The storehouse is in my head, has no labels or shelves, just a space where things arrive and remain. And when I need to know how a woman walks who is tired but doesn't show it, or how a man sits who is waiting for something he's afraid of. I reach into the storehouse, and it's there. It always is. Third, reading. I read a great deal, not just plays, novels, reportage, newspapers, letters when I have access to other people's letters, which sounds like a privacy violation, but in practice means letters in antiquarian bookshops, old letters from previous centuries where privacy is history. I read to understand how people think on the inside, to know how internal narrative differs from external narrative, because each of us tells ourselves our story differently from how we tell it to others, and that differently is where a character lives. Fourth, the physical. The body is an instrument, and an instrument requires maintenance, not fashionable exercises. The point is that the body be fit, flexible, ready to serve. I walk a great deal. Sometimes I dance, not in classes, at home when the radio plays something that demands movement. Once a week I have fencing lessons, because stage swordplay is a skill Shakespeare producers consider an advantage, and while I have nothing to do with Shakespeare at the moment, you never know. The fencing master is 70 years old and is named Mr. Kowalski, which in New York surprises no one. And he teaches fencing with watchmaker's precision and commentary that often has nothing to do with fencing and everything to do with philosophy. A combination I enjoy more than I expected. Saturday, the matinee. The matinee, the afternoon performance, has its own audience, and that audience is different from the evening one. The evening audience came after work, after dinner, in the mood of someone who dedicated this evening specifically. They're more focused, more ready, more clearly present. The Saturday afternoon audience is a mix. Women who came without husbands because the husbands have other plans. Older couples who go out earlier because evening hours are too late for them. Groups of women from the suburbs who made a day of it. Lunch, theater, perhaps shopping. The whole day is an event. And children. Matinees sometimes have children, and children as a theater audience are a separate category requiring a separate description. A child in the theater doesn't yet have theatrical solemnity learned, doesn't know that you don't react loudly, doesn't know that silence is a convention. They react to what they see. If something is funny, they laugh. If something is frightening, they say so, aloud, to their mother. I was once playing a very serious scene, a scene that required absolute silence and concentration from the audience. And halfway through this scene, a little girl, perhaps 5 years old, said loudly, "Mommy, she's sad." Her mother whispered something soothing. The girl said, slightly quieter but still audible to half the house, "Why is she sad?" In the theater, there was the silence of a kind worse than an interruption. Silence trying to be serious when everyone knows someone is about to burst out laughing. I felt the audience hold its breath. I broke character for a fraction of a second, which doesn't happen to me. It was a fraction of a second, and returned and said the text I was meant to say. After the performance, one of the women from that group approached me and apologized for her daughter. I said, "Please don't apologize to her. She was right. The character was sad. And if a 5-year-old sees that, it means I'm doing my job." The woman looked at me for a moment, said, "That's a very good answer." I went to the dressing room and sat alone for a moment and thought, yes, that is why. Not for the critics, not for Harriet's commission, not for the poster with my name. For the 5-year-old who says, "Mommy, she's sad." Because that is contact. That is the thing that happens between an actor and a person who watches. And when it happens truly, when a 5-year-old who doesn't know theatrical conventions and doesn't know you must sit quietly reacts to what the character is doing on stage, that is proof that you've created someone real. That is the goal. Year 1945. Between the first major role and what will come after, There is something that isn't discussed when one talks about an acting career, but which is an absolutely real and long part of that career: the time between. The first serious role ended in 1946. The next big thing will come when it comes. Harriet is working. Auditions continue. But between major roles, there is time. And that time is for an actor both the lightest and the most difficult. Lightest because there's no pressure of a performance, no rehearsal schedule, no director who stops the scene 18 times. Most difficult because there is nothing. The absence of something is harder than something difficult. This is a truth I learned in this period, and which every actress has to discover on her own, because no one tells you in advance. When you don't have a role and are looking for a role, your work is looking for work. And looking for work without a concrete answer to when will you find it is the kind of existence that requires very specific mental architecture to sustain without falling apart. My architecture looked like this. Morning. Voice exercises, work on text, the physical. This is constant. This is independent of whether I have a role or not. Iron that isn't exercised rusts, and it doesn't matter that it's rusting during a period when there's no use for it. When use comes, it rusts just the same. Noon. I go out. This is important. Staying home when you have no work is a trap that turns absence into a climate, and climate into depression. And depression is for an actress a professional danger because it removes the tools, because the actress's tools are her emotional state. I go to Manny's. I go to 42nd Street. I go to the library on 42nd Street. There's a reading room with windows looking out onto Bryant Park, and that reading room has the quality of a place where thoughts have space. And in that space, I read, search, think. Afternoon. Either an audition, if there is one, or a workshop, if there is one, or the cinema, because cinema is work if you approach it that way. Evening. Manny's, Doris, Jack when he's in the city, Elise when she's finished painting, because Elise, while painting, is inaccessible as a planet in a bad orbit. That is the structure. Structure is essential when the external doesn't provide it. When you don't have a director telling you where to be at what time, you must be your own director and be more rigorous than the external one would be, because the external one at least has the authority of a role. Your own authority over yourself you must maintain by will alone. I learned this in 1945, through a year without a major role. A year which from outside looked like stagnation, and from inside was one of the most formative years of my career. Because it was the year I built the architecture that would withstand everything that came later, both successes and failures, and long periods between. I must say something about being a woman in this profession, because being a woman in this profession is not only a personal story, it is a structural reality that shapes everything. In 1947, theater and film employ women. That's obvious. Half the characters on stage and on screen are women, so there must be actresses. But they employ women, and they treat women as professionals are two very different sentences. Female directors, a rarity. Not because women can't direct. That argument I hear, and that is so absurd it doesn't merit a serious answer. A rarity because in 1947, the director holds power over the set and over the actors, and that power is understood as naturally male, which is an assumption that is as cultural as it is absurd. Margaret Crane, the director from The Village whose work I love, exists as an exception proving the rule. Her existence is cited as proof that women can direct, as though that were a fact requiring proof, rather than an obvious truth requiring only opportunity. Female producers, even rarer. Screenwriters and playwrights who are women, they exist, and they're good, and they're often passed over in favor of men writing the same things in the same genres. Clara Marsh, the playwright whose text I'm working on, is the classic example. Her plays are exceptional. Her productions are small. Her recognition is disproportionately low relative to her talent. These are the conditions in which I work. I'm not complaining. Complaint changes less than action. But I'm describing, because these conditions are part of the profession just as much as extra work and auditions and prop hard-boiled eggs. One concrete example. Year 1944. Audition for a role in a film. I'm booked by Harriet. I arrive at the appointed hour, and there is the producer. The producer himself, without an assistant, which is unusual and which I register immediately as information. The producer is pleasant. He asks me to sit. He talks about the project. He's interested. The project is interesting. The role is interesting. He says he's seen me in several productions. He says I have something. Then he says he'd like to have dinner with me to get to know each other better. I look at him. I ask what exactly he means by get to know each other better. He makes the face of someone surprised by the question, and that face is performed. It's the face of someone accustomed to the question not being asked. I say I'm happy to discuss the role here and now, that I have prepared material, and that if his decision depends on anything other than that material, he can make it right now. Silence. Then he says he'll think about it. Harriet calls me the next day and says I didn't get the role and that she knows why, and that I made the right decision. I say, I know. She says, next time will be better. Next time is. Not always, but it is. I tell you this not because it's dramatic, because it isn't, not in the sense that I was devastated or frightened. This is simply part of the landscape of this profession in 1947. A landscape that is wrong, and that I know will change, because injustice that is systemic has the quality of being visible when you know where to look, and when it's visible, you can name it, and when you can name it, you can begin to change it. I don't know when, but I know it's moving in that direction. I want to tell you about the voice, because the voice is the first and most essential tool of an actress, and is a tool that in 1947 is treated with seriousness proportionate to its importance. At theatrical school, Harold Stein taught me voice for a year. After school, I practiced on my own, and throughout my career, the voice has been the subject of daily attention. Not obsessive, not hypochondriac, but constant as brushing teeth. What that means in practice? I never whisper when I can speak quietly. Whispering requires effort from the larynx that speaking doesn't require, and that effort accumulates. An actress's larynx is a muscle that can be overworked, that is damaged by cold and by air that's too dry, and by speaking too loudly for too long. I never shout unless I have to, and if I have to, I do it technically. Stage shouting that looks like a shout but is in reality a projection, that's a skill practiced over years and which protects the voice for years. I drink a lot of warm water. Not hot, not cold. Warm. Cold water constricts the vocal cords. Hot irritates them. Warm is neutral, and neutral is what you need before performing. On performance days, I'm silent for an hour before going on stage. Not literally not speaking to anyone for an hour. I literally minimize speaking. Dressing room, makeup, costume, all in silence or a whisper. And even that whisper is careful. The night after a performance, I don't go out. This is socially difficult, because after a performance there's energy. There's an urge for a bar and conversation and celebration, or processing what didn't work. But a bar after a performance means speaking loudly through loud music for 2 hours, after the larynx has already worked for 2 hours, and the sum of those 4 hours is too much. I skip the bar. Honey and lemon tea. Home. Silence. This is vocal discipline, and it's invisible to the audience and absolutely visible to any actress who works long in this profession. A voice you've cared for over 20 years is a different instrument from one you've neglected over 20 years. My voice after 20 years of work is better than it was when I started. That is not an accident. The last thing I want to tell you in this episode, because it's important and not obvious, how to learn a text. Everyone has their own method, and everyone who says their method is the only correct one doesn't understand how memory works. But I can tell you what works for me and why. First, I read the text without learning it. I read it many times, perhaps 10, perhaps 20, but without intending to memorize. I want the text to become familiar before it becomes memorized. I want the brain to know the shape of the text before it begins to archive it. Then, I speak the text aloud. Not to myself, to someone. To Doris, to Harriet, to the wall if no one's there. But speaking toward something that isn't the air changes something in the way the text sits in the body. It gives it direction, intention, an addressee. Then, I walk with the text. Literally, I take the pages, I go out onto 54th Street, I walk and repeat. Not looking at the pages, from memory as much as I can, and I reach for the pages only when I have to. Movement helps memory. I don't know exactly why, but I know it helps, because after 20 years of walking with texts, the text settles deeper than text learned sitting at a desk. Then, the text must stop being a text. That is the last stage, and the hardest to describe. When the words are in the body, when you no longer have to search for them because they're simply there, then you can stop concerning yourself with them and start concerning yourself with what's more important. Why the character says what she says, what she wants to achieve through these words, what she's truly seeking. The words are the vessel. The content is what you pour into the vessel. The vessel must be invisible, so deeply rooted in you that you don't see yourself carrying it, because then the audience also doesn't see the vessel. They only see what's inside. That is the goal. That is always the goal. Come back for episode 2. I'll tell you what happens when Harriet calls with something I wasn't expecting. With Hollywood.